The sun was setting over the quiet town, painting the sky in orange and red. In a small, modest house near the sea, Mr. James, a kind and hard-working man, sat alone in his study. His hands trembled slightly as he held a letter he had just received. The paper was old, its edges yellowed, but the words on it were clear. He had inherited a large property from a distant relative, a fortune that could change his family's life forever. James's heart beat faster. He had worked hard all his life, but this inheritance could give him the comfort he had always dreamed of. His mind raced with possibilities. He imagined a new home, money for his grandchildren, and freedom from the struggles that had followed him for years. But even as hope filled his heart, a shadow of worry crept in. Little did he know, someone in his own family had other plans. His daughter-in-law, Margaret, sat quietly in the living room, pretending to read a book. But her eyes were sharp, her mind working fast. She had always disliked James. She thought he was old-fashioned, stubborn, and most of all black. She had married his son Richard, not for love, but for the promise of wealth. And now, this inheritance had arrived. Margaret's lips curved into a small, dangerous smile. She whispered to herself, "If that money comes to him, my husband will get nothing. I can't let that happen." She had already imagined a life of luxury designer clothes, expensive trips, and a house bigger than anyone in the neighborhood. But for that dream, James had to be removed from the picture. James, unaware of her thoughts, folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer under his bed. "This is for the family," he murmured. "No one will know yet. I will protect it until the right time." His voice was soft, full of care and love. He had no idea how dangerous Margaret could be. That evening, the family gathered for dinner. The smell of roasted chicken filled the room, and laughter echoed softly. Richard, James's son, was cheerful but tired. He didn't notice the tension between his father and his wife. Margaret acted polite, her smile perfect, her words sweet. But behind that smile, her mind was plotting. After dinner, James excused himself and walked to the balcony. The waves crashed against the rocks below, and the wind whispered through the trees. He felt a strange calm, but deep inside, a small voice warned him that something was not right. He couldn't see Margaret from the balcony, but he could sense a presence, a silent, watching figure. Margaret watched him from the doorway, her heart racing. She thought of the inheritance and of her husband. "He deserves nothing," she muttered. "Tonight, I will make sure that letter never matters." She had no plan yet, but her mind was sharp and ruthless. James stood on the balcony, unaware of the danger creeping closer. The waves roared louder, and the sky grew darker. Somewhere in that darkness, Margaret's scheme began to take shape. The story of greed, betrayal, and danger had started, and in that quiet moment, the secret inheritance became the most dangerous treasure of all. The night had fallen, and the sea glimmered under the pale moonlight. A cold breeze whispered through the town, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and danger. Mr. James was sitting in his study, carefully reviewing old family documents. He had placed the inheritance letter in a locked drawer, thinking it was safe. But he could never have guessed that danger was already moving silently toward him. Margaret paced quietly in her room, her mind alive with plans. Her smile had vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating look. She knew she had to act soon. "If I wait too long," she muttered under her breath, "he might tell Richard, and then everything will be lost." She had studied his routines, his habits, and every detail of his life. Tonight was the night. She walked out of her room and crept toward the living room. Richard had gone out to meet a friend, leaving the house empty except for her father-in-law. The soft tick of the clock on the wall seemed louder than ever. Every step Margaret took was careful, but her heart raced with excitement and fear. "James," she called softly, pretending to be concerned. "Could you come help me with something near the sea? There's something I need your advice on." James, trusting and kind, looked up. "At this hour? What is it, Margaret?" She forced a worried tone. "I just want your opinion. I found something near the shore, and it looks important. Please, I can't do it alone." James hesitated. Something in her voice sounded strange, but he could not refuse. He put on his coat and followed her outside, under the silver glow of the moon. The sand was cold under his feet, and the sound of the waves grew louder with every step. Margaret led him to a small cliff near the edge of the water. The waves crashed violently below. She pretended to search among the rocks, bending down and glancing toward him. "I can't reach it," she said, her voice trembling just enough to seem real. James stepped closer to help, unaware that her trembling was an act. Margaret's eyes narrowed as she calculated the perfect moment. She waited until he leaned over slightly, focused on the rocks, and then, in a swift movement, she pushed him. James stumbled and fell into the cold, dark sea. The water shocked him, and for a moment, panic took over. He fought to stay afloat, gasping for air. The waves were rough, but he kicked and clawed his way to the surface. His heart pounded with fear, not only for his life but for what this betrayal meant. Margaret stood on the cliff, watching, a cruel smile forming on her lips. She thought it was over, that her plan had succeeded. "Finally," she whispered. "Nothing can stop me now." She didn't notice that James had grabbed onto a hidden rock, steadying himself in the water. His mind was sharp, despite the shock and cold. He swam carefully toward the shore, keeping low and silent. He knew he had to survive, not just for himself, but to protect the inheritance and his family. Margaret returned to the house, her excitement growing, not realizing that James was already planning his next move. That night, the sea had almost taken James, but it had also awakened something in him, a cautious, clever side that Margaret could never predict. Her deception had failed, even if she didn't know it yet. The next morning, the house was quiet. Almost too quiet. Mr. James sat in the living room, wrapped in a thick blanket, his body still trembling from the night before. The sea had almost taken him, but he had survived. Every nerve in his body was alert, and every thought focused on Margaret. He knew she was dangerous, and now more than ever, he had to be careful. Richard, his son, entered the room, carrying a cup of tea. "Good morning, Dad," he said, smiling. "You look different. Did you sleep well?" James forced a small smile, hiding the truth. "I slept fine," he replied. But inside, he wondered how he could ever tell Richard what had really happened. He knew it would be hard for his son to believe that his own wife had tried to harm him. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her hair perfectly styled, her smile flawless. "Good morning," she said, her tone sweet but calculated. She poured herself a cup of coffee and joined Richard at the table. Her eyes flickered toward James, and for a moment, her expression hardened. But she quickly masked it with a smile. James noticed it. He noticed everything. The small twitch in her hand, the way her smile didn't reach her eyes, the way she avoided looking directly at him. He knew she was hiding something, and he vowed to uncover it. Days passed, and Margaret grew more impatient. She wanted the inheritance immediately, and she wanted Richard to pressure his father. But Richard didn't suspect anything. He trusted his wife completely and thought his father was simply being cautious. James, meanwhile, began observing Margaret closely. He watched her phone calls, her sudden trips out, and the secretive way she talked to her friends. Something didn't feel right. One evening, as Margaret left the house for a meeting, James quietly followed her at a distance. She walked to the edge of the sea, the same place from the other night, and he paused behind a bush, hiding. Margaret spoke into her phone in a low, hurried voice. "I need it tonight. Nothing can go wrong. He must not interfere. My husband deserves this, and I will make sure of it." James's heart sank. She was plotting something again. This time he had proof, a clear sign of her deceit. But he didn't want to confront her yet. He needed to plan carefully to protect himself and the inheritance. Back at the house, Richard noticed small things that bothered him. Margaret seemed distracted, often lost in thought. She was sometimes late with meals, sometimes hurried with chores. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the unease in the house was growing. James called Richard to the study one evening. "Son," he said gently, "I think we need to be careful. Some things are happening that you may not notice yet." Richard frowned. "What things, Dad? Is someone threatening us?" James shook his head. "I can't be sure yet, but I have a feeling. Margaret, I think she might be planning something. Be alert." Richard blinked, confused. "Margaret? My wife, Dad? You're imagining things." James sighed. "I hope I am, son. I really do. But I cannot ignore what I've seen. Be careful. Watch closely." That night, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The feeling of danger was strong. Margaret had almost succeeded before, and now she was growing bolder. He knew she would try again, and this time he needed to be ready. The days passed slowly, but tension in the house grew with every passing hour. Mr. James moved cautiously, his eyes watching Margaret from afar. He knew she was dangerous, but he also knew he needed proof before anyone would believe him. Something solid, something undeniable. One afternoon, while Margaret was away on a shopping trip, James decided to search the house. His heart pounded with fear and excitement. Every drawer, every shelf, every little corner was examined. He moved slowly, listening for any sound. The house was empty, silent, except for the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional whisper of the wind through the windows. In Margaret's room, James discovered something he didn't expect: a small locked box hidden beneath her bed. His hands trembled as he picked it up. Inside, he found papers, letters, and photographs. Among them was a draft of a letter she had written to a lawyer, claiming the inheritance was rightfully hers. James's stomach twisted. The evidence was right in front of him. She had been plotting to steal what belonged to him all along. James felt a mixture of fear and determination. He carefully copied everything onto his phone using the small camera. This was proof that he could use if things went wrong. But he needed to be careful. Margaret was clever, and if she caught him, everything could be lost. That evening, Margaret returned home, humming a tune that sounded strangely cheerful. She didn't know that James had already found her secret. He watched her from the study, pretending to read a book, while his mind raced with plans. Margaret moved around the house, placing small items in different places, cleaning, and pretending to be innocent. She had no idea that James was watching her every move. His eyes followed her, noting every suspicious gesture, every moment of carelessness. Later that night, James received a message from a friend who worked at the lawyer's office. Margaret had made inquiries about the inheritance, trying to gather information under false pretenses. James's heart sank further. She was bold, dangerous, and greedy. But now he had evidence hidden, undeniable, and ready to use. As the moon rose high in the sky, James began to plan his next move. He couldn't confront Margaret yet. She was too cunning. He needed to wait for the right moment, when her guard was down, when her greed made her careless. And that moment would come soon. Meanwhile, Margaret paced her room, unaware that her plan had already been uncovered. She muttered to herself, "If only Richard would hurry. If only Dad would hand it over. Nothing can stop me. Nothing." Her eyes gleamed with greed and determination. James smiled faintly to himself, hiding in the shadows. He realized that her overconfidence was her weakness. She thought she was untouchable, but he knew the truth. The evidence he had collected would speak louder than words. That night, he placed the copied documents and photographs in a safe spot, a place no one would ever suspect. He felt a strange sense of power, a quiet satisfaction. Margaret may have tried to deceive him, but he was ready. The game had changed, and now he had the upper hand. The house was unusually quiet that evening. Mr. James had spent the entire day planning his next move, carefully thinking about how to confront Margaret. He knew that one wrong step could ruin everything, but he also knew that the truth could not be hidden any longer. Tonight, he decided, the confrontation would finally happen. Richard came home from work, tired but cheerful, unaware of the storm brewing inside his own house. Margaret greeted him with her usual smile, but James noticed the slight tension in her shoulders. She had been pacing all afternoon, restless and impatient, and her eyes darted nervously every time James moved. James invited Richard to the study, and with a calm voice he said, "Son, we need to talk." Richard's brow furrowed. "About what, Dad?" he asked, sensing the seriousness in his father's tone. James took a deep breath. "It's about the inheritance. There are things you don't know. Things that Margaret has done." He paused, watching Richard's reaction. Richard's eyes widened in disbelief. "Mom, Margaret?" "Dad, what are you saying?" James slowly placed the copied documents and photographs on the table. He explained how Margaret had tried to manipulate the inheritance, how she had planned to take it all for herself, and even how she had tried to harm him at the sea. Richard's face turned pale as he read through the evidence. Meanwhile, Margaret entered the study, feigning innocence. "What's all this?" she asked, her voice tight. "Why are you accusing me?" James looked at her steadily. "I have proof, Margaret. You've been dishonest, dangerous, and greedy. And now, everyone knows the truth." Margaret's eyes widened in shock, but she quickly tried to regain control. "This is ridiculous. You're lying." "I never," James interrupted calmly. "Don't lie, Margaret. I have your letters, your recordings, and the documents. You can't deny it." Richard's hands shook as he looked between his father and his wife. "Mom, is this true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret's face twisted with anger and fear. She tried to grab the papers, but James moved them out of her reach. "Stop it," he said firmly. "It's over. You can't manipulate us anymore." The tension in the room was unbearable. Margaret's carefully crafted mask had fallen, and now she was exposed. She realized that her plan had failed, and the people she had trusted to support her, her husband, was now questioning everything, his voice calm but firm. "Richard, I only did this to protect our family and the inheritance." Margaret's greed could have destroyed everything. Richard, finally understanding, nodded slowly. "Dad, I can't believe she would do this. I should have seen it earlier." Margaret, desperate and cornered, tried one last plea. "Richard, please. I can explain. It was for us." But Richard's eyes were now open, his trust shattered. "No, Margaret. I can't let this happen. You made your choice." James felt a wave of relief wash over him. The confrontation had been intense, but the truth had finally been revealed. The family was shaken, but the path to justice had begun. Margaret's schemes had been exposed, and she could no longer threaten the inheritance or the family's peace. The morning after the confrontation, the house felt different. The air was thick with tension, and every sound seemed louder than usual. Mr. James moved carefully, aware that Margaret's anger was dangerous, but he also knew that her power was now limited. The truth was out, and the evidence he had collected made her schemes undeniable. Margaret stayed in her room for most of the day, avoiding Richard and James, but she was not silent. She called friends, whispered on the phone, and tried to find ways to cover her tracks. She was clever, but overconfidence made her careless. One of her friends, unaware of the severity of the situation, mentioned her plans in a public place, and that small slip would change everything. James had already suspected that she would reach out to others. He had been planning for this, and he moved swiftly. He collected all the original evidence, the letters, the recordings, and the documents, and took copies to a trusted lawyer. He wanted everything official, undeniable, and ready for anyone who doubted him. Richard began to notice how the community reacted. Neighbors whispered, friends looked concerned, and small rumors began to circulate. Margaret's attempt to hide her greed was failing. Her carefully polished image of innocence was cracking. People were questioning her behavior, and some even confronted her directly. Margaret tried to fight back, but every lie she told seemed to make her look worse. Her words, meant to deceive, were twisted and repeated by others. The town began to see her true colors: the greed, the deception, and the cruelty. The very plan she thought was foolproof was now collapsing. At the same time, James remained calm. He spoke little, but every action was deliberate. He knew that exposing her publicly was not just about revenge. It was about justice. He had endured her schemes and her hatred, but now with proof. The balance had shifted. One afternoon, the lawyer called. "Mr. James, we have everything ready. Margaret's attempts to claim the inheritance are invalid. The documents, her letters, and her threats are all recorded. Legally, she has no claim." James felt a sense of relief wash over him. Justice was on his side. That evening, Richard confronted Margaret again, this time with the full knowledge of her exposure. "Margaret," he said firmly, "I cannot trust you anymore. Everyone knows the truth now. You can't take what isn't yours, and you can't lie to hide your actions." Margaret's face turned pale, and she struggled to speak. "Richard, it's not what it seems." But Richard shook his head. "No, you planned to harm my father, to take everything for yourself. The truth is out. There's no excuse." James, standing beside his son, felt a wave of calm. The family had survived her schemes, and the inheritance was finally safe. Margaret's power over them was gone. The community had seen her true nature, and the whispers of gossip had become a force she could not control. As night fell, Margaret sat alone in her room, realizing the full weight of her actions. Her plans, her lies, her greed, they had all failed. She had underestimated the patience, intelligence, and resilience of the man she had tried to destroy. The house felt lighter that morning. The tension of the past weeks hung in the air like a heavy fog, but now it was slowly lifting. Mr. James walked through the rooms with a quiet calm, knowing that justice was finally within reach. Margaret, once so confident and cruel, had been exposed. Her lies and schemes had crumbled under the weight of truth. Richard sat in the living room, still trying to process everything. "Dad, I can't believe how brave you were," he said, his voice filled with respect and awe. "I should have noticed it earlier, but you protected us all without anyone even knowing." James smiled gently. "Sometimes patience is the only weapon. And evidence never lies." Margaret, meanwhile, was isolated and desperate. The community had turned against her, and word of her betrayal had spread far and wide. Friends she had trusted avoided her, and even Richard's colleagues were aware of her actions. Her arrogance had led to her downfall, and now she faced the consequences of her greed and cruelty. The liar delivered the final verdict. Margaret had no legal claim to the inheritance. All documents, letters, and recordings confirmed James as the rightful owner. Her attempt to manipulate the law had failed, and any future attempts would be met with strict legal action. The law was on James's side, and the family could finally breathe. Richard hugged his father tightly. "Dad, I'm sorry I doubted you," he said, voice shaking. "You saved everything for us." James patted his son's back. "We saved it together, Richard. Margaret underestimated our strength and our bond. That's what made all the difference." Margaret, realizing her defeat, packed a small bag and left the house. Her steps were heavy, and her eyes, once full of pride and arrogance, now held fear and regret. The life she had imagined, wealth, luxury, control, was gone. She had underestimated the man she tried to destroy, and the consequences were severe. In the days that followed, the family worked together to rebuild their peace. James decided to use the inheritance wisely, investing in education for his grandchildren and supporting the community that had always respected him. The wealth was no longer just money. It was a symbol of resilience, justice, and the strength of family bonds. One evening, James stood on the balcony, looking at the sea. The waves were calm, and the sky was painted with shades of orange and gold. He felt a sense of closure. The storm had passed, and although the memories of Margaret's betrayal lingered, the family had emerged stronger, wiser, and united. Richard joined him, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "We've learned a lot, Dad," he said softly. "About trust, greed, and standing up for what's right." James nodded, eyes reflecting the last rays of the setting sun. "Yes, son. And the most important lesson is this: no one can take away what is rightfully yours, as long as you protect it with patience, courage, and truth." As night fell, the house was filled with laughter, love, and the quiet comfort of safety. Margaret's shadow no longer loomed over them, and the family could finally look forward to the future without fear. Ending line, James whispered to himself, gazing at the stars above. "Justice may take time, but it always arrives, and no greed can ever steal it away."